This is video lecture 6 on John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. We're going to be especially interested in this lecture and the next couple lectures of taking a look at what Mill says in chapter 5 of On Liberty. I don't know how often people read this last chapter in its entirety, but in a way I think this is one of the most important chapters of On Liberty because this is really where we see Mill, by his own account, kind of explaining how what he's had to say about harm and liberty and all that stuff kind of put into action. So again, we closed last video lecture, if you recall, by taking a look at two maxims, the liberty maxim and the social authority maxim. Roughly, these maxims together say that if your conduct does not affect the interests of others, then society has no interest in regulating it, and if it does affect the interests of others, then you may be liable for punishment, coercion, and other kinds of stuff. Okay, so how would this play out when we actually take a look at some issues in applied ethics? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, one thing, by way of background, one of the things to know about Mill is that he's a pretty good example of what we might call a libertarian. And by libertarian, I don't mean American-style libertarian, which is its own distinct political party in the United States and shares some stuff in common with libertarianism, as I understand it, but most political libertarians aren't really libertarians, and we can talk about why. One of the things that libertarians, and certainly libertarians like Mill, would presumably recognize is something like a right of self-ownership. In fact, a very strong right of self-ownership. As a right of self-ownership implies that you have the right to basically do with your own body and person what you have a right to do with your private property generally. With respect to our own private property, we can use it as we see fit. We can trade it and transfer it as we see fit. That means like sell it or exchange it. We can even destroy it or abandon it in the way that you might, leave a pop can on the beach or something like that, or in the way you might throw it in the recycling bin and be done with it. In the same way that we have the rights to use and exercise our private property as we see fit, we have the right to use our bodies and our persons as we see fit, according to the typical libertarian. Now, obviously, there are restrictions on that. In the same way that I can't use my private property in a way that's going to be harmful to you, I can't just throw my soda can at your head or something like that, so I can't use my body in ways that might be harmful to others. That's completely consistent with what Mill has said about harm to others, though, isn't it? That's completely consistent with the social authority maxim. But it shouldn't be a surprise then that we should find libertarians to be very suspicious of sex laws that criminalize sexual behavior between consenting adults that affects no one else. We would expect them to be advocates of the decriminalization of at least drug use and casual drug use and drug possession, because it's hard to see how those things harm anybody else. Things being different, say, driving under the influence and maybe certain kinds of drug trafficking. With respect to a couple other issues, we would expect that libertarians should be in favor of things like open borders. Controversial topic right now, but typical libertarians think that you have a liberty of contract, that you should be able to sell your labor to whomever or whoever is willing to contract with you. And to the extent that we have strong border regulations that prevent people from seeking work, that's a violation of their liberty. So it's going to be interesting then to see what Mill has to say about trade, what we might call commerce. These words don't necessarily mean the same thing in 21st century United States as they did in 19th century Britain, but just go with it. Know what Mill says about trade here, or again, what we would understand as commerce. Mill says that trade is a social act, right? Social act to be contrasted from a private act. Mill says, whoever undertakes to sell any description of goods does what affects the interests of other persons and of society in general, and thus his conduct in principle comes within the jurisdiction of society. Now, this might be a little bit surprising here. Mill is claiming that trade, commerce quite generally, is a public thing. So even if I sell my car to you, you and I come up with some kind of contract, we arrange what we think is a fair bargain, I exchange money, give you my car, which you now take possession of. That's not really a private transaction anymore. It becomes a public act, according to Mill. This might be a little hard to see, but there's examples that will sort of help here. One of the things that most economists would agree with is that some kinds of trade can certainly have public consequences for third parties. Think about someone's pursuing a monopoly, for example. So suppose I am a rich guy and I start buying up all the insulin in the United States, all the insulin in the world. Suppose there's only a handful of companies that actually produce the goods that you need to make insulin, and I start buying stock in all their companies, and I acquire corporate control of all of them. In those circumstances, where I have proprietary rights to all the insulin in the world, I could have a monopolized market and I could charge pretty much whatever I want for insulin. And if you're diabetic, you'd have to pay for that, whatever price I set, otherwise you're going to die. That would certainly be a case where my private transactions have consequences for third parties. Now, true, most of our acts of trade, most of our acts of commerce don't have those kinds of consequences, but we can think of other examples as well. The United States Supreme Court, for example, seems to regard trade, at least some kinds of commerce, as public acts, if only because those acts can have consequences for other people. So, for example, part of the reason that the Supreme Court of the United States, found it to be perfectly constitutional to forbid people from failure to rent on the grounds of race was because it could have consequences for others. So, for example, if I'm a hotel owner and I don't want to rent to black people, that is a public act, says the Supreme Court. Why? Because it affects other travelers who may now have to find other routes to travel when they're planning their trip through the area that I do commerce in. But it might also have consequences for the larger community. If the community of Saginaw, where my hotel is, gets a reputation for being deeply racist and is not wanting to engage in commerce with African American and black persons, well, that's going to affect other businesses as well. So we might wonder just, how private and how public particular acts of commerce are. This is going to be especially relevant when we think about, for example, cases involving homosexuality and, say, the famous cases of photographers who didn't want to perform their services for a gay couple, for the guy who didn't want to bake cakes for a wedding cake for a gay couple. Whether these are really private acts of commerce or whether they are public. It's interesting to think about what Mill would say about this, but he's pretty clear early on. Mill thinks that trade is a social act, and therefore, because it's a social act, because it affects the interests of other people, you really can't claim that it's private anymore, and the social authority maxim rather than the liberty maxim is the relevant one. Mill himself, the liberty maxim is not involved in the doctrine of free trade. It might interest you just because this term keeps coming up from time to time, Mill in his autobiography regarded himself as a socialist. On my reading of Mill, he didn't regard himself as a socialist in the sense that he thought you had to go in for a fair bit of Marxist metaphysics. He didn't talk about the materialist dialectic or any of that kind of junk. He didn't talk about end of history and so on and so on and so on. But what he did think is that unhinged capitalist markets did not necessarily have just outcomes, and even if the operation of free trade generally lent itself to maximizing utility, that was certainly a common utilitarian thought. He would have denied that the operation of free markets, quite generally, would necessarily lead to the best outcomes. So that is the only sense, but it is the relevant sense, in which Mill regarded himself as a socialist. Now, there's still more implication from Mill's views here, but this is probably an interesting one to start. We still have to talk about sin taxes, and I want to talk about what Mill says about procreation and marriage in a bit more detail. All of this is supposed to be an extension of the doctrines of Mill that we've discussed so far, namely what we've called Mill's principle, but also the liberty maxim and the social authority maxim.